We're going to talk about the values of a greenhouse movement on page 10 in the manuals. Now, this course is about leadership development of us and of others, and really the method, God's method of developing Christian leaders who will go and make disciples of all nations. His method is the church. So we must have churches that are willing to give themselves away. We must have churches that are willing to raise up and send out leaders. And that's what the greenhouse idea is all about. Really, again, it's a metaphor of a place that recognizes these seeds of leadership and develops that in another in order to send them out for the purposes of the gospel. And it's not something we do in isolation, it's something that we do together. So with that in mind, let me take you through some values of a greenhouse movement when we as churches and districts and even regions and as a country, nationally and internationally, can work together. Here's some of the values. The first is relationships, which is the primary vehicles by which we can build and support a pathway to sending other people out through church planting. We operate in relationships, and that's absolutely vital. Raising up and sending people out is not a hierarchical kind of thing. It's something that has so much to do with relationship and influence and building into others and giving ourselves away to others. Ownership. Each church, each person, each leader, each movement must contextualize their own planting pathway. In some ways, we're trying to do the same thing, completely different, in different cultures and different contexts, but we're all trying to raise up people that can move the gospel forward. And that requires ownership, personal, contextual ownership from each leader and each church. So the way that the churches that I've planted or the churches that I've attended won't do things exactly the way that your church might. You won't do things exactly the way that I might. So we need to understand what needs to be contextualized, but we need to do it together in relationship with ownership. Collaboration, working together, is the best way to equip and support church planters and to support leaders. Dr. Stumbo said it, we said it as our Alliance themes in the past. We're better together. We're better when we collaborate. We can bring different ideas to one another and help each other along. Even this course is a matter of collaboration, of people coming together. Multiplication. This is really the goal in many ways of leadership development, to multiply leaders so that we might multiply churches, so that we might multiply the different ways that people can be reached with the good news of Jesus. It's a strong value for us, a willingness to give our best leaders away for the cause of multiplication. So those are just some of the values that we have. Well, how do you measure values? My friend and mentor, Dr. Matt Hannon, talks about 4 different ways that we can measure what it is that we value. To write it down and say that we value it is not the same as actually valuing it. So what do you value? What do I value? Well, if you spend some time with me, or if I spend some time with you, I want to propose 4 places where we can look to determine what our values are. This just recognizes reality. Here they are. Values are measured by, first, contemplation, which is a fancy way to say what you think about. I know what I value by what I think about. What's on your mind the most? What are you thinking about? What am I thinking about? If I know that about you, or you know that about me, we'll know each other's values to some degree. And these are all C words, by the way, so they just sort of line up. The next one is conversation. I know what I value by what I talk about. Number 3, we know our values by what we put on our calendar. How I spend my time expresses my values. How you spend your time expresses your values. And finally, a C word for cash, checks, credit cards, whatever it might be. We know what we value by how we spend our money. So just think through that quick grid. What do you think about? What do you talk about? Where do you spend your time? Where do you spend your money? Now, there's so much we could say about any one of those. But let's just put this in the realm of leadership development and church multiplication. So if I were to look at a local church, I would know their values pretty quickly by what they as a church think about, which will be expressed by what they talk about, how they spend their time, how they spend their money. So if we're going to be about multiplication, and specifically sending people as international workers or sending people as church planters in the United States, if we really value that, if we really value planting, if we really value sending, there's 4 things our church must do to express that value. We need to think about it. We need to talk about it regularly, publicly, in small groups, everywhere. We need to spend our time on it for leadership development, spend time in the scriptures understanding it, and we have to spend money on it. And if we're not willing to spend our thoughts on it, or our talk, or our time, and our money, then we really don't value it. So how can we come to a place where we do value it? Well, I think that works in reverse. We begin to intentionally think about it as a congregation. We start to talk about it publicly, from the stage, from the front, in our small groups, in our Bible studies. We spend time on it, and we start to budget accordingly to the Great Commission Fund, to sending out international workers, to planting churches. And as we start to do that, something can happen within our hearts where our hearts will open up to the idea even more. So if we're serious about leadership development with the same thought, if you're looking at people you want to develop in your ministry, are you thinking about it? Are you thinking about what their needs are? Are you thinking about this? What seed, what spiritual gift has God put in that person that you're currently discipling and hanging out with? How can you help that seed grow? You're thinking about it. You're valuing multiplication. You begin to talk about it with that person. Hey, I see this in you. What do you think that looks like? You have the conversations. And in doing so, you start to spend some time on it. Maybe you go to some conferences together and some places where they can learn and experience things together. And of course, it begins to cost. And if we're looking to send out leaders as a church, it's going to cost us some money as a church, and we need to be willing to spend our time there and our money there in order to express our values. Right now, you have on page 11 a little exercise called 10 Ways to Help a Church Plant. We do this with church planters and church planting leaders, and you'll see 10 different ways here, which, by the way, I wrote this here many years ago, but these are things that were all done for me as a planter, and these are things that I have done in the churches that I've planted and led for other planters. There can be more than 10 ways, so make some up. But what we ask leaders to do is think through. You'll see 3 words: receive, done, and plan. So think through the ways that maybe you have received this as a person or as a leader. Think through then some things that maybe you have done for someone else if you're in a church leadership position. And then think through finally some ways that you might plan to help someone else. And I'll tell you how this works when we do greenhouse training for our local churches in the Alliance and beyond the Alliance, really. Pastors and leaders are gathered together for the purpose of becoming multiplication churches, and so we ask them to think through these 10 different ways that they could do something to help someone else. And we ask them to not leave our conference until they've written down a few things that they plan to do to help someone else. Why do we do that? Because we're getting back to Acts chapter 11 with Antioch. Do the best you can with what you have. So if we can encourage the development of another leader right now, that will open up a way for us to maybe send a leader somewhere down the road. So we'll give you some time to think this through, write some things down, and however it works, whether online or in groups, talk about it for a little bit.